we just finished a cohort a couple months ago, and we're starting another one starting in November. And this intro evening is just to give an introduction to the system and an introduction into somatic developmental psychology in general. So the format for the evening, I'm going to go over an introduction over the program training format, what we do in the training. Then I'll introduce myself and a few of the other people here in the room, as well as the instructors. And then I'll go over the training progression. What are the options after the training, and what other kind of somatic developmental psychology trainings there are. I'll go over the story of how the Bodynamic system was created. Then I'll discuss the 7 developmental stages, and you can see them here on this poster. And then we'll do a boundary exercise, and then hopefully, if I have time, we'll do an introduction to autonomy. We'll cover the will developmental stage. And then I'll briefly discuss trauma and how we look at trauma in the Bodynamic system, and then how to apply it. So the training itself is highly experiential. I would say probably about 60 to 70% of it is going through direct experiences, and only about 30% is sort of lecture style theory. So unlike this intro talk, which is probably about 90% theory, the training has a lot more movement involved in it and working directly with your body. So in the training, we start off with going through the developmental themes, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. And then we go into developmental movements, and then there's lectures on healthy development and early and late disruptions. I'll explain that later as well. There's parent-child exercises, what healthy parent-child relationship is like, what unhealthy is like, what are sort of the shades of gray in between. And then you actually take on the character structures, what it's like to embody them, and we practice that. Then we do subgrouping. People in the training will typically split up into common themes within the developmental phase, what kind of traits they associate with and what traits they don't associate with. Then there's a demonstration session, so a therapy session that the lead trainers will do with the person in the room. And so we have, again, 2 for each developmental stage, 1 for each character structure. And then there's supervised practice sessions. So in the supervised practice sessions, you actually get to practice doing bodydynamic therapy, and you practice using the muscles that were learned, and you contain the muscles to a specific developmental theme in the practice sessions. So the lead trainers for the training are Anne and Joel Isaacs. They're a couple. They live in Venice, in Los Angeles, in California. And they've been doing, I think they got trained in the Bodynamic system I believe it was the early 90s. So they've been doing this for over 20 years. Prior to that, they had their training in radix, which is a Neo-Reichian form of somatic psychotherapy. So they have a long history in this. They're the only trainers currently practicing in North America. And so I find it's a real privilege to be able to bring them up here to Edmonton. They've only trained in Edmonton so far and Vancouver when it comes to Canada. And my name is Jonathan Zerbin. I'm an assistant trainer. I've been working with Anne and Joel for the last 4 years. I've assisted them on about half a dozen trainings at this point. I'm also still currently a student in the Bodynamic system. I fly to Europe on a regular basis to do training there with the founders of the system. I've also trained in integral somatic psychology, which is a somatic system developed by Raja Salam. He's one of the lead somatic experiencing trainers. I've also taken training in system-centered training, which is sort of a group psychology. But most of my training has been in the Bodynamic system. So the Bodynamic system was invented and developed in Denmark. So there's actually 2 Bodynamic organizations. I work for both of them. I think I'm the only person that works for both of them. So Bodynamic International teaches in over 13 different countries, and currently there's a waiting list of 5 countries that want the Bodynamic training. We just don't have enough instructors to send there. And but the Bodynamic training that's coming to Edmonton is being offered by Bodynamic USA. Bodynamic USA has, again, I think been around since the 1990s, and they're the ones, Bodynamic USA is the organization that has primarily done the training here in North America, in the USA and Canada. So when it comes to the healing arts, or the healing and personal development sort of paradigm, there's sort of 3 broad categories in terms of working with humans. There's the physical, which would be more like massage therapy or physiotherapy or even chiropractic, so where you're working really anatomically and mechanically with the body. There's the psychological field, things like CBT, psychoanalytics, different psychotherapies, which sort of fit into this category. And then there's the energetic, which would be things like Qigong, maybe Chinese medicine, Reiki, biodynamic, craniosacral. And so a lot of people specialize in one of these 3. And maybe you'll find someone that has decent knowledge of 2 of them and works across 2. There's very few systems in psychology that aim to incorporate all 3 in a holistic kind of a way. And so the Bodynamic system is probably one of the most comprehensive systems in terms of trying to bring all 3 of these things together. So because it's so holistic, it adds complexity to the system, and that can sometimes intimidate people, but the depth into which you can go with the system by coming at it from all 3 angles really helps. So in terms of training progression, the training that's coming here in November is this one down here. We called it Healing Developmental Disruptions, and I'm going to get into later why we called it that. It's the equivalent to the European training called the Foundation Training. So it's really an introductory training into the Bodynamic system. When you complete this training, then there's integration modules that are offered that are sort of review and bring and tie in all the things that you learn in the introductory module. Or the alternate route is to go into the practitioner training. And the practitioner training takes place over 3 years. It's 75 days, and it's fairly intensive and involved. And that's the training you would go through if you want to be like a full-blown Bodynamic therapist. And then you can also learn, once you've completed 2/3 of that, you can learn how to do body mapping, which I'll explain. Currently, I'm 2/3 of the way through the practitioner training. I'm doing my practitioner training in Germany, so I fly there every 3 months for a week to do the training there, which is really exhausting, but I wanted to do that just so that I could learn the system and then help bring it back to North America. We haven't had a practitioner training in North America, I think, in about 15 to 20 years. From the last cohort, almost everyone has decided they want to do the practitioner training. So what we're aiming to do is bring the practitioner training back to North America, bring it to Edmonton, here specifically. And we just need about another 5 or 10 people, and then that training will be a go. The other major training that's offered by Bodynamic International is the shock trauma training, and that deals specifically with PTSD, which I'll explain a little bit about that later. Other trainings include reorienting birth, which I actually don't know too much about. And then there's various workshops that are offered in Europe as well as North America. Does anyone have any questions so far about anything that I've covered? Okay. So I'm going to jump straight into the Bodynamic story and how the system was developed. This woman here, Elizabeth Marker, she's the founder of the Bodynamic system. She was trained as a relaxation pedagogy, also called psychomotor education. And I'm not quite sure, it's sort of like a cross between a social worker, a physiotherapist, and a psychotherapist. I haven't been able to find anything that's analogous to that in North America. it seems to be something that's more specific to Denmark, and I think the other country that has this is Hungary. And Lisbeth was working with clients back in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And when she was working with people, she noticed that when making contact with specific muscles, that an emotional theme or a psychological theme would emerge. And massage therapists have noticed this too. When they're pressing on certain muscles, it will evoke an emotion in the client. And she noticed that working with different clients would, if the same muscle was palpated or worked with or stretched or massaged, that there was a similar emotional theme that would emerge. And so what she started to do is she started to correlate between different clients, and she had a team of people that were working for her, and she got them to start looking at their clients as well. And so she embarked on a really ambitious project of mapping out 125 muscles and fascia in the body and what the specific psychological themes are for each individual muscle. And so that research began in 1969. It lasted for about 10 years, and they went through about 15,000 case reports to start building up this collection of knowledge of what the psychological aspects and themes are to specific muscles and fascia. So the other person that's really important in this story is a physiotherapist by the name of Lillemor Johnson in Norway. So Lisbeth Marker was aware of her work, and Lillemor Johnson was working with children on playgrounds. And she noticed that certain children would have difficulty doing certain activities on the playground versus other children. And when she was examining the muscles that were involved in doing things like hopscotch or skipping, she noticed that the kids that were struggling, if she pushed on the muscle, it would have what's called a hypotonic response. So the pushing on the muscle, it was sort of like the muscle's mushy, or kind of like whipped cream. And so she was the one who sort of discovered this responsiveness of the muscle to contact, which is a little bit different than tension. Then she also noticed that certain muscles were in a state of sort of extreme tension or extreme responsiveness, where if you pushed on the muscle, it would push back immediately. And so Lisbeth Marker was aware of the work of Lillemor Johnson, and so she developed a scale for testing muscles. And the scale it's like a 9-point scale, and the muscle response, again, is to contact. So it's different than the tension of the muscle. It has nothing to do with the inherent strength of the muscle or the flexibility of the muscle. So you can have muscles that are tight in terms of tension-wise, but are still hyper-responsive. And when you start getting to sort of the extreme ends of this hyper-responsiveness, that's when you're in the trauma sort of area. And that's indicative of traumatized muscles, and as well as traumatized sort of psychological aspects, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So here's the result of about 10 years of research headed by Lisbeth Marker. It was the development of the body map. And so each muscle gets tested. I've had this body map done. This one isn't mine, this is someone else. It's a random body map. And through testing all these muscles, it takes about 3 hours. You lie down on a table, and the muscles are tested for their hyper or hypo response. And this gives you an indication of the psychological and the psychomotoric development of a person. So, in terms of the themes, the emotional themes that were evoked when working with the muscles, there was originally 10 categories, and then there was an 11th one that was added. And these are the themes that the psychological or the psychomotoric themes when it came to testing the muscles. So Connectedness. A lot of the muscles in the chest and a lot of muscles in the back have to do with connectedness. And so the concept of feeling supported by someone, hugging someone. So these are the muscles that we're using to make contact with another person. So those are the muscles that were given the ego function theme of connectedness. Positioning in regards to positioning yourself in relationship to other people or in a group. Positioning yourself in regards to norms and values. A lot of the muscles in the spine, as well as muscles in the back of the leg, have to do with this particular ego aspect. Centering, the ability to center inside of yourself. A lot of the muscles in the hip area, and as well as in the butt area too. And then muscles in the chest, which have to do with self-esteem. So those are the centering muscles. Boundaries, muscles here in the arm. So the deltoids, anterior medial deltoid and posterior deltoid, have to do with making space for yourself and setting boundaries. And then muscles in the quads. So children, when they are trying to make room for themselves, they'll kick or they'll try to wiggle away. And so a lot of the muscles in the quads have to do with boundaries. Grounding and reality testing. Grounding, naturally, muscles in the feet have to do with grounding, so a lot of muscles in the toes. And so they have to do with testing what's real, what's not real, what's my imagination, what's not my imagination. And also muscles in the spine, because when infants are born, they can't walk, so they can't stand on their feet. And so they're actually grounding through the erector spinae along the spine. And then also muscles in the neck have to do with grounding. They actually have to do with centering as well for the first developmental stage. Social balance, so the ability to balance your needs with the needs of other people. How do I sense myself in regards to a group? A lot of the muscles on the side of the body. So they have to do with not only physical balance, but also social balance. So, and you can see the movements that people make when they're balancing themselves in relationship to others. Cognitive skills. Cognitive skills, a lot of the muscles in the hand, as well as muscles in the feet, because they have to do, there's a crossover between grounding and reality testing, and the ability to cognitively grasp something, or the ability to understand something, as well as muscles in the back of the head that have to do with planning. Management of energy. So energy management, if you think of the body and you think of the torso, we feel our emotions primarily in this area. So because we feel our emotions primarily in this area, or when there's a high charge of emotional energy, a lot of the muscles in the neck have to do with energy management because they're containing muscles sort of from here down. Muscles, intercostal muscles between the rib cage bones have to do with energy management. Abdominal muscles also on the side, or fascia on the side of the leg, have to do with energy management, and some of the muscles in the back. So it's sort of, it's what builds the emotional container for where we feel emotions and feelings.
It's often when you see people dealing with a lot of big emotion, suddenly their breathing starts changing because they're engaging the energy management muscles in a different way. Or they'll be sitting in a room and their leg starts bouncing. And that starts bringing a little bit more awareness into muscles that are otherwise used for energy management.
Yeah. And then self-assertion, so the ability to assert yourself, the ability to come forward with yourself. Muscles in the back of the leg have to do with self-assertion, and some of the muscles in the chest as well. Pattern of interpersonal skills, so being in a relationship, navigating interpersonal space. A lot of the muscles in the arms. So this is almost primarily muscles in the arms. So they have to do with the ability to give, the ability to receive. And so these are all sort of psychologically mapped in that way. Gender skills, this is a more recent ego function that has been added. This gender skills is sort of a combination of many different muscles. There's muscles on the inner thighs, which have to do with energy management. Sensuality, sexuality, has to do with role ego or your gender role, so muscles in the chest. And then there's various muscles also throughout the whole body. Any questions about any of that?
a huge grid of information to try to take in all at once.
So centering muscles, here's a picture sort of what they look like. These are the ones that are taught in the training. And so in the training that's coming, we learn about 6 muscles for each developmental stage. And these are all the centering muscles that are learned. So you have a centering muscle in existence, you have one in need, autonomy, will, love, sexuality, opinion, and solidary performance. So psoas is like a centering muscle for autonomy, it's for your impulses. Gluteus medius is a centering muscle for sensuality and love. And then gluteus maximus is a centering muscle for solidary performance. Grounding muscles in the neck, and then again, a lot of the muscles in the feet as well as in the back. So the 4 core elements of the bodynamic system are muscles, character structures, which I'm going to spend a lot more time covering that, ego functions, and ego aspects. So fundamentally, there's 7 developmental phases. There's actually sort of a little bit more. There's perinatal and prenatal, and then there's also the teenage years. But in the training, we just focus on the primary 7 developmental phases. Each developmental phase splits up into 2 character structures, one on the hypo-responsive end and one on the hyper-responsive end. So that makes for a total of 14 character structures. There's 5 ego aspects. That's something I'm not going to cover, and that's not something that's actually covered in this training. It's covered in more advanced trainings. The 11 ego functions. In this training, we don't learn all the ego functions. We primarily focus around 3. We focus on grounding, centering, and connectedness, and specifically feeling supported in relationship. And then there's like I said before, there's 125 muscle and fascia that the bodynamic system has mapped for their psychological abilities. So this really gives you sort of in a nutshell, this gives you the full spectrum of what the bodynamic system is about.
Part of the reason that Joel and Anne focus primarily on just 3 of the 11 ego functions is because their focus with the healing developmental disruptions system, the training, is around helping people who are already working with people in any kind of capacity to integrate the bodynamic system into what they're already doing. So that what you're already doing, you can just do with more tools and do a little bit differently, a little bit better in one way, or a little bit more comprehensively in another way. So it's really meant to be an adjunct to what you're doing as well.
So I'm going to cover the developmental phases now. So the first developmental phase is existence. And this one starts already in the 2nd trimester, and it goes to about age 3 months. And this developmental phase, the themes around it have to do with your right to exist. And so as soon as you're born, the infant is learning about the space around itself as well as the space within itself. So this is a relatively abstract developmental phase. It's very nonverbal. There's sort of a sensing of energy, a sensing of bodies, sensing of emotions. And so that's this developmental phase. The next developmental phase starts at about 1 month and goes to 18 months. And this has to do with the right to have needs and be satisfied. So I call this developmental stage the breastfeeding stage. And so this is when the child is learning how to take in. At first, the breastfeeding is a reflexive response, and then it becomes a conscious act later on as the muscles and sort of the psychology get developed. And this developmental stage has to do with rhythms. It has to do with rhythms around sleeping, rhythms around feeding, getting your diaper changed, having your parents check to see how hot you are, how cold you are, and then make sure that you're comfortable. And so this developmental stage focuses really around the ability to take in not only physically, but also relationally. And so I like to think of it as the developmental phase also around intimacy. And the next developmental phase, autonomy, starts at about 8 months. This is when the child becomes mobile, when it starts crawling around, when it starts exploring its environment, starts seeing interesting objects it wants to get to, and then also when the child begins walking. And so the theme of this developmental stage has to do with autonomy. Then the next developmental stage, starting at about age 2 and going to age 4, has to do with your willpower. So the right to be intentional, directed, and willful. And so this is when children start to pick up heavy objects, they start to carry them around, they have the ability to make choices, they'll say things like no, they're starting to learn about boundaries and making space for themselves, and then they can start to do rudimentary planning as well. The next developmental stage, love sexuality, has to do with the right to feel loving and sexual feelings or sensual feelings at this age. So this is between ages 3 and 6. This is when children start to become aware of gender, when they start to have romantic feelings, when they start to ask parents, do you love mommy more, or do you love me more, or do you love daddy more? So they start navigating the realm of relationships, and sometimes they'll fall in love with an adult, and it's a very innocent phase. It's also a very sweet phase where children are very sweet. The next developmental phase is opinion, and this is between ages 5 and 9. And this is when children start asking questions like, why is the sky blue? Why is grass green? And they start learning about the norms and values of society. They start noticing that Bobby's family has dinner at 5 o'clock and we have dinner at 6 o'clock, and why is there a difference? So they start asking questions. And so the first 5 developmental phases they're more nonverbal. They have to do with your bodily experience, how you experience yourself and how you experience yourself in relationship with those around you. Once you start going into opinion and performance solidarity phase, there's new cognitive capacity that comes in, and so you start thinking about things in more abstract ways, and you're able to mentalize things. And so there are muscles that are associated with this mental capability, and that has a lot to do with the cognitive skills. And then the last stage, performance solidarity, the right to be a full member of a group, and also be apart and stand apart, and you can compete and perform. And so this is when children start playing group games, when they start presenting, when they start coming out with themselves. And the way I think about this developmental stage is it's the developmental stage of mastery. It's all as you're going through the developmental stage, more and more muscles in the body are coming under conscious cognitive control. And that's really how the Bodynamic system, this developmental model, was created. So first it was created by this correlation between people and checking their muscles and what emotional theme would come up. The second piece of information was that different muscles come under cognitive, sort of conscious control at different stages of development. And so as they come online under conscious control, there's an emotional theme that gets associated with that muscle, or gets sort of imprinted in that muscle. So for example, in autonomy, when the child's crawling, it's engaging the quadratus lumborum. So that becomes then an autonomy muscle. In existence, when the infant is learning to move its head, the muscles in the neck then become associated with the existent developmental phase. With will developmental phase, the levator scapula, strong muscles in the shoulder, strong muscles in the leg, then get imprinted sort of with the themes around that developmental phase. And in performance solidarity, it's really a bringing together of all the muscles, and it's the highest degree of fine-tunement with the muscles, where the muscles have the greatest dexterity, and there's also the greatest amount of psychological nuance that comes with that level of dexterity. So here's an overview of the developmental phases. And again, starting with existence, you can see that it starts before age 0. It starts already in the 3rd trimester. And so there's a little bit of overlap between each one of the developmental phases. So muscles, therefore, oftentimes, some muscles are associated with multiple developmental phases, and some muscles are associated more primarily with a single developmental phase, depending on where the themes overlap or not. So I would say this principle of is sort of the core value, or it's the core fundamental of the bodynamic system, and that has to do with mutual connection and dignity. And so the idea of mutual connection and dignity can be summed up in the phrase of, can I be all of me, and can you be all of you, and can we still be in a relationship together? And this is a sort of a complex question to answer. And so what's important here is there's the early position and the late position. And this, again, maps out earlier to this hypo-responsiveness in the muscle or this hyper-responsiveness in the muscle. So in the early position, there's a giving up of a part of the self in order to maintain a relationship. So for example, if anger is something that's not accepted, by my parents or by my family or by my community, I might give up on that part of myself that has the capacity or the power to be angry. And so that leads to a kind of resignation, not only psychologically, but also physiologically in the muscles. And so if I'm not supported in my curiosity, I might give up on my curiosity, I might give up on my impulses. Or if I'm not supported in my needs, I might give up on my needs and might go into a state of resignation. And so this leads to feelings of emptiness or lack, or like there's something missing but you just don't really quite know what it is. And there tends to be a lower energy with this kind of developmental response. On the opposite spectrum, you have what we call the late position. And so in this one, you give up the relationship to maintain a part of the self, or what you'll do is you'll hold back a part of yourself in order to maintain the relationship. So you could give up on your anger, or you could hold it back, and then it becomes sort of like under a pressure cooker. And so this developmentally leads to things that are called armoring and shielding, which is that those ideas and concepts come out of the older somatic psychology models from Wilhelm Reich. And so there's a higher energy, and this tends to result in muscular tension.
So, Jonathan, could
Yeah.
you say that the word would be collapsed?
Yes.
And then rigid in the other?
Yeah. So the early position would be sort of the muscles are collapsed. That psychological aspect of yourself is collapsed. And in the late position, it's rigid, or it's armored. So another reason that it's called early and late has to do with the type and timing of nurture. So there's this sort of nature versus nurture debate that you may be aware of in the field of psychology. And this has to do specifically with nurture. So going back to this diagram. So for example, I'll be talking about will later, but just to sort of reiterate this point, as a child starts coming into its willpower right at around age 2, if the child's coming into its willpower and the parents are really domineering and very aggressive, and it happens really early in this developmental phase, right as those abilities start kind of coming online, then it will tend to fall into collapse. So that there's a part of development that just kind of gets missed because the stress in the environment is too high. If the child is older, maybe 3.5 years old, closer to the end of the developmental stage, and it's had a lot of time and it's had a lot of support in developing this part of itself, but then it gets met with stress or resistance of some kind, that will tend to put a person into the later position where there's a lot of armoring, there's a lot of tension, because the psychological, the toric development has had time to get established, has time to develop. And so it's there, the capacity is there, but then for one reason or another, it needs to be held back, or the relationship needs to be sort of put on hold or given up. And so that's what results into these two positions. So when it comes to the question of can I be all of me and can you be all of you, maybe I can't be all of me. Maybe there's parts of myself that I need to hold back, or there's parts of myself that I need to give up. And so when it comes to each individual, we're going to have a mosaic of these depending on the type of nurture in each developmental phase. So in one developmental phase, our strategy for maintaining the relationship was to give up on a part of ourselves. Maybe in the next developmental stage, the strategy was to hold a part of ourselves back. And then in the next developmental stage, it might have been to give up again. And so each individual can oscillate back and forth on this spectrum of early to late, depending on how the parents and how the caretakers relate to the child and how good they are in different stages. So some parents might be really good with babies, but as soon as the child becomes mobile, it's kind of like, well, I don't know what to do. Or if a child goes into its willpower, then an aggressivity starts to form in the relationship. Or in opinion character structure, when children go to school, the teacher or the peers might be really judgmental, and that can lead to an early response in opinion character structure. On the other hand, if the teacher is very supportive of children asking curious questions and answering those questions, then it can lead to healthy development in that developmental stage. So all these character structures here on the left are the early ones, and then all the character structures on the right are the what we call the late ones, or the hyper-responsive ones. And so the Bodynamic Somatic Developmental Psychology model is really a model on character development, which is different and distinct from personality development. So people are much more than just their character. So I think it's important to caveat that. But the character, as it's expressed through the body, as it's experienced in the body, is mapped out through these developmental stages, and whether it splits into sort of an early position or into a sort of this later position with the armoring. Any questions about all of that? It's kind of covered. There's a lot to cover.
Maybe just a comment. We haven't said much about the middle position, which I think you referred to as either balanced or integrated.
Yeah. So if the parenting was good, if the child was met, if the child was supported in all the right ways, then you end up somewhere sort of in the middle, between the two extremes, and that would be considered more or less the healthy position. Okay, so I'd like to do a little exercise with you guys, and I'm going to demonstrate this with my brother Anthony here. And so this is a boundary exercise. Actually, I should mention a little bit about boundary development first before we do this. So boundary development is important in that a lot of people think that boundary is this. It's a stop and it's a disconnection, and that's sort of the unhealthy form of boundary development. Healthy boundary development is being able to be in connection and maintain the boundary. And so that's what the purpose of this exercise is. And so I think there's at least 4 boundaries that we consider in the bodynamic system. The first boundary is the skin boundary. So that's what when children are rolling around or infants are rolling around. And we do this in the class. We practice all the developmental movements. We go through them in the training.
You see a little kid do it, we're doing it as well. So it brings out a lot of fun in the training groups too, when you see 20 adults crawling and stumbling and rolling. It's great fun.
Yeah. So skin boundary is the first boundary. And so that's how we differentiate between self and the rest of the world, the other world. Then there's the personal boundary, or the personal energetic space, and so that's about arm's length. And then we have our territorial boundary. So our territorial boundary would be like our bedroom or our car, for example.
Get off my lawn.
Or our house or our property. And then beyond that, we have social boundaries as well. And so when you see some people, when they don't have good personal boundaries, they'll try to use their territorial boundaries to compensate for the lack of personal boundaries. And so the way you can see this is people who are very particular about their vehicles and the space that their vehicles take up, and if they get really upset or aggravated really quickly if there's someone comes in a little bit too close, it's their territorial boundary that's really compensating for the lack of personal boundary. Another way in which you can see people asserting their boundaries or their lack of boundaries is through when a spouse comes home or a partner comes home and they drop their jacket off here, then their pants come off here, then the socks end up over here.
But just one of them.
And they're really marking their space. And so it's really an unconscious way of, it's kind of like a dog peeing for its territory. Humans have their own way of sort of marking their territory in that way as well. And so boundary development is really important. You can't really connect to yourself until you have a proper boundary. It's also important for energy management. You can't really sense your boundary. You can't manage the space of energy inside of yourself as well.
It's coming back to that whole idea of mutual connection. Can I be all of me and can you be all of you? If we don't have a boundary between what is me and what is you, it's really hard to have good mutual connection. So in this way, having a clearly established boundary allows for the best quality of connection.
Yeah. Okay, so let's demonstrate this, Anthony.
Okay.
So what you'll do is, you and a partner, I'll give you about 5 minutes to do this. You'll take a staggered stance and put your hands up and put static pressure into your hands. So there's sort of like there's a static weight that you're applying. And then I want you to try this with eye contact and then without eye contact as well. And then say the phrase, you have your boundaries and I have mine, and we can still be in contact. And really sense what's going on for yourself physically in your arms. Sense the connection to yourself, that's the most important. So if eye contact causes issues around merging or something like that, it's just, you can look down and look back into yourself so that you stay connected with yourself.
It's good to be really curious.
Yeah.
In a sense of, hey, what's this new sensation? Maybe you get a flushing in your cheeks and like, oh, that's a lot of eye contact, I can't do that. or maybe it's like, oh no, I've got no issue with this. Or, oh, I'm feeling like I'm floating off the ground.
Yeah.
But it's slowing it down and really just taking the time to be curious about the sensations that you're experiencing in contact and as they change. Well, what stays the same?
Yeah. Okay, and then we'll do the other one. So this one, you're pulling. So you do a static pull.
Do a little less pressure.
Okay.
Yeah. Too much, and you're focusing on the exertion and not the sensation.
Yeah.
So you can really play with what your limits are with your exertion and your sensation.
And so the first one is pushing away and still maintaining contact. I can have my boundaries and I can still be in contact. The second one, pulling in, is I can take contact in and still have my boundaries. It's not like I'm merging with Anthony here and losing myself in the connection. So it's the ability to take contact in, yet still maintain the boundary. Mm-hmm. And so boundaries are a really important part of maintaining our own personal sense of dignity and keeping the mutuality in the relationship requires separation, it requires individuation. And so this exercise helps facilitate that. So find a partner, try it out. You have about 5 minutes, and my brother and I will walk around. So now I'm going to go more in depth into 2 developmental stages. The first one I'm going to go into in depth is autonomy, and I'm going to discuss some of the developmental themes and then how the split in this developmental phase occurs. And so autonomy, again, has to do with curiosity. The child's becoming mobile. First it starts creeping, then it starts crawling, then it learns how to walk. It points at things that it's interested in. The muscles for the pincer grasp come online, and they'll start picking up little objects on the floor. And it's also the first step away from the mother. And so prior to this developmental stage, the child's sort of energy field is really merged symbiotically with the mother. And so as it's stepping away, it's starting to center in itself, it's starting to learn about its own impulses, it has the ability to venture out on its own. And so this is really where the start of the development of individuality comes in. And this has to do with, what do I like? What shiny object do I want to go to versus another one? What's my favorite color? Those are the kinds of things, again, the things that make you uniquely you. This is where children start to learn about themselves in that way and start to explore the environment in that way as well. So when things go wrong in this developmental stage, there's the early position, again, and then the late position. And so in the early position, for example, the way this can come about, and so each one of these developmental positions can come about through multiple different sort of variables. But one way in this one might come up is parents that take their children and put them in playpens for their own safety. And so they're sort of stuck in these playpens. They don't have the ability to explore the environment around them. And so when they're not supported, or they're penned up, or they're sort of caged off, then they'll give up on their sense of impulses, or they'll give up on their curiosity. And so it could be like being put in a playpen. It could also be if the parents are too busy and they don't have time to pay attention to the child and the environment it's exploring and what it finds interesting. And so, again, the child will give up on its own desire and impulses. They'll wait to be sort of swept off their feet, and then going on as adults, and they'll seek and want other people to stimulate them. They exhibit a charming, sort of innocence and playfulness. And so they have this sort of doe-eyed look in their face, and they avoid unpleasant feelings by walking away without talking. So this developmental stage in the bodynamic system is called nonverbal activity changing for this reason. And so as adults, they tend to despise boxes, they tend to despise labels. They will definitely not like this character structure system at all. And they prefer ambiguity. Because in ambiguity, anything can mean everything. And there's always a way out for something. And you can't be pinned down, you can't be caged up. And so it's an avoidant type of a strategy. And so inside, they tend to feel empty, or they'll call it the void sometimes. The counterpart to this, the late autonomy position, this character structure is formed by when the parents or adults, when the child has something that it's interested in, and the parent comes in and sort of takes over or sort of invades the space of the child, sort of like a helicopter parent, being very controlling over the child in this developmental stage. So you got to remember, children, they're running around, they're going everywhere in this developmental stage, getting into all kinds of things they shouldn't be getting into. And so if the parent invades too much, one of the defensive strategies it can do is it can look over there, and it'll try to distract the parent, or to try to distract the adult. And so, in both these positions, there's there's this sense of they can't dare how much something means to them, because if they show what something means to them, then it might be used against them. So this is where manipulation comes into play. So a child might have a favorite stuffed teddy bear, or a favorite toy or object, and then if the parent learns that and then says, well, you can't do this, or otherwise I'm going to take that away on you, then the child starts to feel manipulated. And so then it might be like, okay, well, I'm not going to let anyone know what something means to me because it could be used against me. And so as adults, they can't be told what to do. They have issues with authority, in quotation marks. They tend to be commitment phobic because of this. In the late position, they change topics in conversation frequently and abruptly to avoid uncomfortable feelings. So again, if something feels uncomfortable or it's getting too close to something that is meaningful, it's like, okay, we're going to change the subject. We're going to talk about sports now, or something else. In this position, people tend to feel quick to boredom, and therefore they keep busy. So in the late position, there's an abundance of impulses. There's actually too many impulses, and they're running after each one, and they can't settle down on a specific one. And also show too much interest in them, and then they start getting scared of being taken over, and then they evade. And then they also try to do everything themselves. So here are some pictures of what the early autonomy looks like in adults, as well as Eeyore has a little bit of this too. And so they have this really sort of pleasant way about them. My grandma has this character structure, and she knits and she paints, and she's very easygoing, and she sort of sits there and waits for things to happen, but she's not the one really initiating anything. In the late autonomy position, this is the charismatic, magnanimous one. And this meme in the top right corner is pretty classic of what this character structure is like. And so going a little bit further and deeper into this, in the early position, when these individuals are with other people, their impulses disappear. But when they're alone, they can be flooded with impulses. So when they're at home alone for the day, they're just busy going from here, doing this, then doing that, and then doing this, and then doing that. And then their partner comes home, and then it's like all the impulses just disappear. And so they also have a difficulty in perceiving time. And so if you try to make an appointment with these people, they tend to be late, or they just might not show up, or something else might come up. And there's a constant struggle between emptiness and being lost. And when in contact with others, they feel like their boundaries are constantly getting invaded, and so then they need to withdraw to recharge. So they also do not want to be controlled, and by losing themselves in contact with others, so they can lose themselves in the excitement of somebody else. From their perspective, it's a way of avoiding being controlled, because it's not their impulse, it's somebody else's. And so the statement, "Don't take my impulses, I will give up on them before you get to them," is sort of is very symbolic of this position. So I have two friends that have this early autonomy character structure, and they're both going through midlife crises right now. They're both in their late 30s. And when I was asking them, well, what do you want to do? An early midlife crisis.
I'm like, oh God.
I mean, these crises can happen at any age, really. But I was talking to them and asking them, I'm like, they're both in positions where one career ended or one path ended, and they don't know which one to take. And then as I started asking them questions about, well, what's meaningful to you, they go blank. They just don't know. And then they get really sad. And so there's a real sadness underlying this character structure about not knowing what it is, what's meaningful to me, or what it is that I find value in, or how I find my purpose in life. So in the late autonomy position, they experience commitment as a loss of freedom. So they always keep the back door open, or they'll always keep one foot in the relationship and one foot out. When pushed to an extreme, they can cut off all emotion and sensations and become really cold and calculated. They're charismatic, but they're constantly living in fear of being revealed as an imposter. So this is where the imposter syndrome comes from, this specific developmental phase. And so for them, excitement covers the emptiness, the fear of emptiness. And so they avoid this feeling of underlying emptiness at all costs, and they do that by really connecting with their impulses and constantly being engaged in activities. So I have one friend in this character structure, and if I need to make, I know I can't set an appointment. Like if I want to be like, I want to meet you on Thursday at 2 o'clock, it just won't happen. So I learned that if I want to get together with this friend, that the best thing to do is, if I want to meet him, I call him like half an hour before I want to meet him and be like, hey, are you available? And if he goes, yeah, and then I go see him. But like, I don't dare ever try to make a long-term plan with him. And again, it's this commitment phobia, even just as around simple meeting, friendship meeting around a time, it's like, well, maybe something more interesting might come up. Why would I make a commitment to you over meeting you? Like, I don't know what my tomorrow is going to be like. I don't know what will happen. So both of these positions, they really live in the present moment, but the present moment is kind of running away from the continuity of relationships, or the meaningfulness of relationships.
And so would you say parenting is like the determinant between someone developing early or late autonomy, or is there other factors that kind of determine what category someone lands in?
It's primarily parenting. But I mean, grandparents could be there too, uncles and aunties. Like, it really depends on the environment that the child is brought up in. Yeah?
As you're pointing these out, you're speaking as individuals being one or the other. And it seems to me that they can be a mix of both.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, so.
And even at different times.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, yeah, your question is a really important question. And so for simplicity's sake, we split these two. But no person in the world is one or the other. People have a tendency to lean one or the other, or some people will really be a mix of both of them. So for myself, for example, when it comes to this character structure, I'm about, I think it's 60% of the early one and then 40% of the late one. And so, and again, it can change from environment to environment or from situation to situation. And so everyone will have a mix, and when the body map is done, you can actually see your percentage score on each one of these developmental phases, and you'll always be a mix of both. And then occasionally you'll come across a character structure where you're really extreme in one way or really extreme in another way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's a really important point.
Would you say that the early autonomy would be like an introvert and the late an extrovert?
Yeah, probably. But not like extrovert and introvert. That's from the Bodynamic model, it's sort of a really complex way to determine that.
To me, an introvert sort of displays similar to the early autonomy and an extrovert.
Yeah. Early autonomy people can sometimes, they can be really drawn to social situation in high energy environments because they're really stimulating. So that makes them, does that make them an introvert if they're really drawn to a lot of stimulation? Not really. But if their energy management isn't really good and they become overwhelmed really easily, then that would make them an introvert. So from the Bodynamic sort of reference frame, extroversion or introversion has more to do with boundaries and energy management. And so if you have poor boundaries and poor energy management, it doesn't matter what kind of situation you get into, you can get overwhelmed really quickly. But if you have good boundaries and excellent energy management, then you can go into social situations and you won't feel so overwhelmed and then have the need to withdraw and recharge.
And that's just an example of how the character structures and then the ego functions map over each other and intersect in interesting ways.
So the similarities between the early and the late position is that they both feel empty inside and they search for meaning on the outside, through impulse activities rather than it being generated from within. So in therapy, when you're working with people that are struggling with issues in autonomy, it's really important to affirm them in their unique individuality and the meaning that inherently comes with that. And to sense that, so from within, so the impulses, the meaning, the purpose is something that's coming from within. And so again, here we work a lot with centering muscles to try and get people to become aware of their bodies, become aware of this inside part of themselves. And so boundaries, again, may be a prerequisite, especially for this developmental stage, because it's an anti-manipulation measure. Because otherwise, if you get too close, then these individuals, you could scare them off, where they'll just end the relationship because it's like, no, this is too vulnerable for me, I don't want to go there. And so it's really important to be sensitive in regards to when you're working with people and when it comes to developmental themes of this nature. So the need to develop the ability and sense support and being able to go deep into things that are uniquely meaningful to them. So again, connectedness, a lot of the muscles in the back. You learn muscles like the trapezius is a great place to put a hand and support someone to explore themselves and to really find meaning inside of themselves. And so one of the strongest defenses available to people with autonomy issues, out of sight, out of mind, don't worry, be happy. They'll have this kind of a philosophy.
One of the things Anne said in one of our sessions that was really punchy and poignant that I took a little bit too much to heart, much to my wife's dismay. As I identify with a lot of the features of the autonomy stage, is it's not that I don't love you, it's just when you're not there, I forget you exist. I'm like, ooh, that's a bit harsh of a way of saying it, but that's a little bit of what's going on with autonomy. It's the world is really exciting and I'm just moving from one shiny thing to another, and kids are really easy to distract that way. It's like, oh, I'm taking one toy because I don't want you playing with that one, but here's the other one you can play with. And I'm like, oh, okay, and then they're really happy. But that's what happens even as adults. So when we're dealing with this with adults, is if something's really uncomfortable, I'm gonna change what I'm doing or what I'm talking about, and then I can manage what's going on. I can manage the stress that's going on by starting a different project while the other one never gets finished. So
yeah, when you get stressed and then have the impulse to go shopping and then you have another impulse to buy lots of things, that's an autonomy coping strategy. So when the stress level rises too much, you start to go into impulse shopping. And then like another classic way in which I see issues in this developmental phase being formed is when children get really sad in this developmental phase. Sometimes adults will come along, oh, here, look at this. And so if the child isn't met in its sadness, or it's not met in its anger, or it's not met in its difficult emotion, and it's constantly being taught, well, look over at this shiny object, then it learns that its emotions are not important. And it learns that, oh, maybe these emotions, I shouldn't feel them, I'll compartmentalize them. And then it becomes sort of this learned coping strategy based on a relationship with those kind of features. So therapy traps, when it comes to working with these developmental phases, these character structures in early autonomy, oftentimes they'll ask questions like, what do you think I should do? Where should I go? And you being the good therapist or coach or counselor would be like, oh, I know what you should do. And then you give them advice and you give them your opinions. And that's exactly the opposite what you want to do. And so what you want to do, again, is instead get them to be curious about themselves. Get them to be curious about their own impulses and what's meaningful to them. Because they really struggle in this area. And so in the training, we learn various muscles and various ways in which we can support people in developing this connection with themselves. With the late autonomy, the trap here is following process. So they'll talk about this, then they'll talk about that, then they'll talk about this, then they'll talk about that. And then if you try to follow that, it's just a never-ending journey. And so you have to use a little bit of will and discipline to to start to make a contract with a client so that you can stick with a specific subject or theme so that they're not using this verbal activity changing to try to get away from feelings that are uncomfortable. And so now we'll go a little bit more in depth in the will developmental phase. And so this is between ages 2 and 4, when children are starting to really sense and feel the power of their bodies. And so they start learning about choices, they start learning about consequences, they learn about the difference between I intend to do this, or my intention was to do this, but my action might have been a little bit different than my intention. And they start to learn about others in this way. They manage their power, being with power and being without power. Balancing between acting for myself or out of a sense of altruism. So a sense of altruism is, again, one of the important things that's developed in this stage. The expressions of all emotions at full blast, containing, regulating, again, your own sense of power. Experiencing 2 emotions simultaneously. This is, again, another complex step. Prior to this age, children feel emotions one at a time. So experiencing 2 emotions simultaneously, and even as adults, some people struggle with this. Can I be angry with my partner and love them at the same time? Is that possible? Or is it, oh, I'm angry at them, the relationship has to end? Or I can't, because if that's true, then I can only love them, I can never get angry at them. So in the early position, in the hypo position, it becomes challenging, it becomes really tricky to navigate having conflicting emotions or multiple emotions towards someone if that wasn't supported in this developmental stage. The development of roles. So this is when children start to play, I'm Papa, you're Mama, and these are what our roles are, and we're going to have a child, and we're going to take care of it, or we're going to have a house, and you're going to mow the lawn, and I'm going to cook and clean. And so they start to learn about roles, and they take them on, and they start to pretend with them and play with them. And so planning with regards to a sense of time is also something that starts to happen in this stage. It's like, do you want 1 candy now, or do you want 2 candies in an hour from now? Prior to this age, it's like, no, I want the candy now. And when they start developing, again, this sense of time, the ability to delay satisfaction, and they can start to plan things. So, in the early position, the parents, and again, this can come about through many different reasons and many different variables. But the parents sometimes will have the attitude of treating the child with, do for me, not for you. And then the child will give up on their own sense of power, and as they give up their own sense of power, they'll do it to serve and please others. Or if the child is crushed and smothered when using his or her own power, it's like, no, I'm the boss, you're just this tall, like, you don't have any power, I'm the one with the power. If that's the dynamic, then again, the child may give up on its own sense of power. So as adults, they tend to experience themselves as inadequate because they believe they should know without asking or learning. And so people with this character structure will tend to throw themselves into situations and projects where they really don't have the competency in that area, but they're going to try anyways. Often they'll give up power in one way to gain it another way by taking care of others. So this is really where the caretaker kind of character structure, the caretaker archetype comes into play. They tend to be proponent to black and white thinking. And again, this goes back to, can you experience 2 emotions simultaneously or not? There's a burdened, a proud, an altruistic, devoted, patient, martyr kind of sense within this developmental stage. And then they also experience guilt, shame, and low self-esteem. And they tend to be very self-critical. In the late will position, the parents will, if the parents isolate the child when he or she acts from their own power, that can form this. If the child's anger isn't supported, and then they learn to hold it back, that's what can also create this character structure. So the child is unable to feel connected to the family when they use their will and their power. They experience then that it's the other's fault, so they become very blaming and critical of others. So in the early position, they blame themselves and they're critical of themselves. In the late position, it's the other people's fault. They feel only powerful on their own, and when they're on their own, it's like full blast. Again, holding back on anger, strong emotions, and vulnerability results in a lot of upper back and neck tension, maybe their scapula and all the muscles in the ear, and as well as in the upper back. And there's this concept of can't relax unless all the work is complete, which it never is. So actually in both positions, they can get into this sort of workaholic kind of a trap. So pictures of what the early will character structure looks like. This drawing here comes from an academic article about the Bodynamic system. And it's very indicative. The tail's tucked slightly, the head comes forward, but it comes sort of down. And in the child, the head is tilted down, and usually there's a look of shame in the face. And the late position, I thought Grumpy Cat was very, very good at being very judgmental on everything that's going around. So statements coming along with the early will position: life is hard and I will suffer with pride. I'm a good person, so why does this keep happening to me? If I give, I will get rid of my guilt. My reward will be getting rid of my guilt, which kind of just never happens. It's sort of this self-perpetuating cycle. There is something wrong, it must be me. And here, the anger at self covers the anger at others. So for whatever reason, anger at others was not supported when this child was growing up. And so one form of anger covers another form of anger. In the late will position, life is hard because you jerks cannot figure it out. This is not fair, I deserve better. If I give you something, you owe me. So this position is called judgmental for a reason. If you just change your behavior and do the right thing, our relationship will get better. And here, the anger fundamentally covers compassion. And I'll explain that in the next couple slides here.
One of those was just a little bit more convincing from you than the other.
Yes, I have a tendency towards the judgmental position. But I do have some of the self-sacrificing. I have some of the early will as well. So both the early and the late will, they struggle with anger being coupled to power. So to be powerful means to be angry, which means the end of the relationship. So they both struggle with it. The early will not express their anger for fear of ending the relationship, and so they'll just give up on that emotion, and they'll like really suppress it, repress it. Like it's almost like it doesn't exist. And in the late position, it's like really held back, and it kind of comes out sideways, or it's like not there, and then it also comes out. So it's like it has a sort of passive aggressive kind of quality to it. So the early doesn't allow themselves to be angry at others. It takes their anger and turns it back on the self. This is where things like depression can start forming. And the late just holds it back like a pressure cooker. So both the early and the late want to save the world and to be loved. And so the idea is, if I save the family, then they must have time for me. And so that's where this real caretaking and this real sense of altruism can come from in both the early and the late position. The late position, the early one will take on this sort of self-sacrificing role. The late position can take on this really judgmental but protector role. And so the unbalanced will loses themselves in their own altruism. So both the early and the late position, fundamentally there's a feeling of powerlessness. And they gain power through doing rather than it coming from the inside through being. And so they're constantly, in the early will position, they're doing things for other people, they're using their hands, they're constantly engaged in activities, and it's by being engaged in constant action and using the power of their bodies, that's where they derive their sense of value, and that's where they derive their sense of power. And the same thing with the light will position. So they both can get kind of stuck in this situation where it leads to burnout, or too much stress is sort of what they'll come in as clients as. It's like, I'm stressed, and then it's like, well, where's the stress come from? Well, I probably work too much, or I probably don't manage my time. So both struggle being playful with their power in a relationship. And so the exercise that we were doing before, again, had to do with, can you be in your power? And can it be playful? Like, it doesn't have to be serious. It doesn't have to be anger coupled with it. And so, again, the early and the late have this sense of I have to, I need to, I should, I have no choice, I feel obliged to, or it's expected of me. And so it has this sense of this feeling of obligation of I need to do something in order to have value. Instead, what we want to move towards is I choose to, so I'm able to choose these things out of my own free will, and I can drop it if necessary. So in therapy, the will needs to have their power affirmed and to be met in a powerful way, and so to have it really supported. So when we can sense our own power, then we don't need to try and control as much. So when people are feeling really powerless, the coping strategy is to try to control things in their environment, or try to control, in the late position, to try to control other people in order to feel secure in themselves or powerful. But it just, it's a lost cause.
Could you give an example of how you could affirm their power in therapy? What would that look like?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from one of the training sessions. There was a man who was, he didn't like that it was either too hot or too cold in the room, and he couldn't quite hear people, but he didn't want to speak up and say anything. He didn't want to offend anyone, and he felt like he was being too, so he was just holding this back, and then he started to get really angry and resentful about it. And then he would pipe up, and it's like, I'm upset about this. You guys aren't getting it. I'm sitting here and I'm suffering because you guys aren't doing this. But he never said anything, and he was just sort of holding it back. And so the trainer, she worked with this gentleman, and she got him to say the things that he was holding back, and to say them with power. And so what she got him to do is stamp his foot on the ground and say no, and no, I want that, and no, I don't want that. And then she was standing there and looking at him, and she was doing it with him. So she's mirroring him being in his power. And the more he's embodying it, the more he's expressing it, the better he starts to feel. It's like, oh no, I don't need to hold back this part of myself. I can say something. If I'm uncomfortable, I can speak out. And so that's how meeting that power is can be important. Another way is if a client is in the late position and struggles with a lot of anger, or they're holding a lot of emotions in, again, you can meet them, and you meet the intensity of their anger. So one trainer was working with me, and she said she got really angry at me. She was looking at me, she goes, okay, now meet my anger. And I'm looking at there trying to get angry at her, and it's just not working. And she just locked gaze with me until I found it in myself to be able to meet that anger. And then, so it's through the mirroring that our nervous system can calm down. So all these developmental stages, when we're working in therapy, mirroring is a really important principle, because we learn about ourselves in relationship with others. And again, that's a fundamental principle for all of this. And so we learn to self-regulate through co-regulation. And with certain emotions, it could be sadness, it could be anger, it could be excitement. It's going to be different from person to person. So if you can find the one that they're holding back or that they're not expressing, and then meet that in relationship, physically and emotionally and mentally, then someone can feel they can start to be like, they can start to own that part of themselves.
Yeah.
Another example I had, a friend of mine had a baby daughter, and she was 1 month old, and she had the late position of the existence character structure. She had the emotional one, and I could see that. And he was holding her. I was meeting her for the first time. She was 1 month old, and I looked at her, and she had this like expression on her face, like exasperation and like despair, and she just did not look like an attractive child at all. Like it was just, she looked so emotionally dysregulated, and there was sort of like this real intensity in her eyes, and she's just looking all over the place. And like my first impulse was like, ugh, I don't want to meet your baby kind of thing. And then my second impulse was like, well, and then I felt really bad. Now my altruism came in, and I was like, well, you know, the second impulse is like, well, I want to soothe the child. But instead of turning away or instead of soothing, what I did is I looked at her straight in the eyes, and I matched the intensity of sort of the expression in her face just for a second. And the second I matched the intensity of what was going on for her, she instantly relaxed and then gave me this most beautiful smile. And so it can happen really quickly. And with children, again, it's all nonverbal. And so mirroring is really important. And it's like one of the top, as a therapist and as a counselor, it's one of the toughest things to do with clients, especially when it's difficult emotions we haven't mastered ourselves.
Yeah.
A question related to the muscles and the body mapping. Is that primarily for diagnostics, or is there, maybe you'll talk about this later, do you work with the muscles in terms of therapy or a remedy?
So the muscles and the body map is the empirical basis for understanding all of sort of the psychology. So it can be used as an empirical tool to test to see whether a certain intervention is working or not. When you get a body map done, so Ariane and I, we flew to Denmark and went out in the middle of nowhere, and we had the woman who teaches how to do body mapping do our body maps. And then we went to Elizabeth Parker, the founder, and we got an interpretation of the body map. So in that sense, it becomes an analytical tool, where you can analyze yourself and you can start to understand, where are my blind spots? Where are the things I don't know that I don't know? Or where are my strengths and where are my weaknesses? And how does this compare to other people? And so in that sense, it can be an analytical tool that informs therapy if you have someone that can do the body maps. In North America, I think there's only 3 people trained to do body maps, whereas in Europe, there's like several dozen. So it's hard to find someone to do one. But yeah, so it's an analytical tool, it's an empirical research tool, and then it helps inform. So I got my body map done, then I went to my therapist, gave him my body map, and then he's able to look at what are the muscles that are given up to a certain degree, and how can we integrate those into therapy and work with those. Does that answer your question? So we'll lead into one exercise. So 2 of the muscles that are taught, 2 of the 6 muscles that are taught in this developmental phase are the deltoid posterior. And so they're muscles on the back of the shoulder. And so they have to do with, they're a boundary muscle and an interpersonal skill muscle as well. And so I have the power to make room for my decisions, and so the movement is this. And I do things for my own desire. So it's really making room for yourself with this kind of motion. So it activates this muscle. So the energy management and interpersonal skills muscle, the levator scapula is just a muscle here in the neck. And so that has to do with being able to shrug your shoulders. And so it's a high-level energy containment muscle, and it also has to do with your ability to make choices. So this is when children are able to put a backpack on and then carry heavy things either by their hands or on their back. And so this muscle really has to do with making choices. And so this one is just simply the shoulder shrug activates that muscle. And so now we're going to combine these two into the shoulder shrug toss exercise. So Anthony, grab a chair, and I'm going to show what this one looks like. All right, you can sit down and face away. Thank you. All right, so. Okay, so the point of this exercise is the first thing, the person sitting in the chair is going to be the client, and they're going to feel the weight of obligations and responsibilities they have. So pick something, pick something that you feel obliged to do, or something that feels like it's weighing down responsibility-wise. And so
make sure you have permission to touch.
Yeah, and
You have permission, by the way.
Yeah.
exactly. I'm your brother. I would know. Where are you, mommy? Where am I? All right. So, what you want to do is you want to put hands on this area and just put a little gentle pressure, not like heavy pressure, just a bit of gentle pressure. And so, then Anthony, the client, he's going to feel the weight of all his responsibilities and obligations, and then what he's going to do is going to lift up his shoulders. So that's the beginning of the shoulder shrug, and then put his arms back like this. So it's just a shoulder shrug and a toss, kind of combined into one. Yeah. So, not so fast, Anthony. All right, and so he's going to do it, and then as soon as he does it, I'm going to take my hands off. So I'm going to take the pressure off. And then so do this about 2 or 3 times. How's that feel?
Feels good.
And so as the person sitting in the chair, what I want you to do is, as you're doing it, say, I can do what I want when I want.
Oh, I'm so excited.
You can do it.
How will I hurt myself?
Okay, and so really sense what it feels like to do this. All right, so you guys have about 5 minutes. Try it out with a partner. Yeah?
It felt really awkward at first, and I didn't really believe myself when I said it. It just felt like a joke. So.
Yeah.
But by the 3rd time, I was like, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the muscles, when I first start using them, I'm like, I don't feel anything. I'm like, this is bullshit. It's not working for me. And so sometimes, if it's a part of you that's really undeveloped, you won't feel anything and it won't do anything. And so then it does require practice, or it requires trying a different kind of a movement. So that's really important. So it's important to give yourself some time, and maybe it won't work. Some of the exercises, maybe they'll never work. Maybe you are resourced in that area and you're fine and it doesn't really do much. So it can really depend from individual to individual. So when we're doing this kind of therapy, there's a lot of paying really attention to what is going on for that person. Does this feel good for them? Does it not feel good for them? What's coming up for them? What we really want to do is we really want to tailor it to where's someone at. Are they more in the hypo position, like it's foreign to them? It's foreign to them to sense the ability to do that, or are they holding it back? And it's like, don't touch me. I don't like to be touched there. And then, so if a client doesn't want to be touched there or doesn't feel comfortable, you can get them to do it themselves as well. So a lot of the exercises. So contact is a big thing. In using contact, touching people is a pretty big thing in the Bodynamic system, but it's not required. People do Skype sessions. If you're working with a couple, you can get them to do the exercise with each other. So there's a lot of ways around. If contact isn't something you like doing or someone is uncomfortable, then you shouldn't do it. So it's important to say that. Some closing remarks. The way I found out about this was through one of the trainings that the Bodynamic system was through one of the trainings I was taking part in, and the instructors just mentioned the word Bodynamic and something about muscles, and I got really interested in it, and I looked it up online, I read everything I could. Then I flew down to Los Angeles, and then tried the therapy for the first time. And prior to that, I had been seeing a Harvard-trained neurologist, really super smart therapist guy, who did have some somatic training. And but when I had my first session with Anne down in Los Angeles, the trainer, it just completely changed my life. I was struggling with social anxiety for my whole life, and in one session, it basically solved it. And I discovered I had developmental trauma in the need of really pre-verbal stage, but she's so good, and she just went straight for it, and it just profoundly impacted me. I remember walking out of the session and walking to my hotel and being like, wow, I can't believe that happened. I didn't even know something like that was possible. And the other realization I had was that because I knew a little bit of the back theory of what she was doing, I could kind of follow her process a little bit, and I was like, what she's doing isn't like, to me, she seemed like a magician or a wizard, but I knew there was a science behind it, and that this could be taught, and that I could learn it, that other people could learn it, and that if other people could learn this and work in this way, I mean, the amount of impact that could have on the world would just be so profound. So I have to say, I'm really happy to be able to bring Anne and Joel up here to teach this system to people here in Edmonton, my home city. We've already had one training. Everyone that went through the first training, I think almost every single person is going to be going on doing the practitioner training. So I've just been blown away by the support and the interest that I've gotten from people here in Edmonton. So I'm just really happy to share this with you guys, and I hope you got something out of this presentation, even if you don't come to the training. So thank you very much for coming.
Are there